start the recording as well, and others can come in as they do. Okay. So, all right. So research with Aboriginal peoples. So we're speaking about there are several guidelines that the Tri Council has when working with uh, Aboriginal populations or working with Aboriginal researchers or both. We spoke about decolonizing research. We spoke about equity and the idea of uh, benefiting the community from research. So, research doesn't mean stealing ideas, sacred songs, stories, etc., um, or just using that information and not giving the community anything. So that's essentially abuse. Now, when we talk about equitable treatment of Aboriginal researchers, it's the idea that all these funding agencies, they are based in Canada, and Canada is built on Aboriginal land. Um, so grant panels, there's no doubt about it that Aboriginal people must have a stake and a say in determining where grant funding goes to, particularly if that research is concerned with Aboriginal affairs. So grant panels must have Aboriginal members so that they can determine the merit and the benefit of an application. And it doesn't have to fit traditional Western guidelines, but it should have an Aboriginal perspective for sure. Aboriginal researchers with or without traditional qualifications, so they might not have a PhD or a master's, but they might be knowledge keepers in their community. They must be identified in research projects. So this is what they are talking about when they say equitable treatment of Aboriginal researchers. And they must be trained. The community itself must be engaged in a research process, and they must be trained in research methods so that they benefit. For Aboriginal people, because the history of colonization has been so negative, there's been a great loss of self-worth. Obviously, their rights have been lost as well. So, for them to recognize their own self worth and rights and help them move forward, researchers must collaborate with them to collect data or to design experiment, or even when mentoring them as thesis students. And this happens in the School of Uh, Rural and Northern Health. There are several professors that will mentor Aboriginal students, and if possible, they should be hired as assistants or translators in any way that they can be part of the research about their own community. So, I mean, it's absolutely a waste to go into, say, the Atikameksheng First Nation here for a research project and then not have some of the people in the community assist you with collection of data or even some of the research design and so on. So it's not only do we have an obligation to Aboriginal people in their, but it's also creating the opportunity. Now, we have to realize that several Aboriginal communities have their own ethics codes, not necessarily for research, but for a lot of things around them. So they have their own ethics code, and this is based on consultation where between their band with other First Nations and so on. And they might also have some outside influence if they've sought it out. The whole idea is these ethics principles are based on community ownership of data collected. So if any research, any work is done on them, the whole idea is that the community owns this data. They have access to this data, and they actually own um, the research processes affecting these communities. Now, all the big three, which is the SSHRC, NSERC, CIHR, they have advisory bodies that oversee research for and about Aboriginal people. The whole idea, the big picture is that Aboriginal scholars and other knowledge keepers, they should have access, control, and full responsibility for managing the research on Aboriginal issues. So the idea of Igasventa, and I'm not sure that I'm pronouncing it correctly, the idea is that it's a hand-in-hand partnership and a joint exploration. In practice, Aboriginal communities should be involved in all aspects of the research project process that pertains to them, their lands, their people, especially when it's the welfare of the entire community, when that's involved. Um, Aboriginal communities must directly be involved when data collection occurs on their land. When the recruitment or even when it's not on their land, if it's off First Nations, then when recruitment criteria has one of the requirements is Aboriginal, or when cultural heritage or tradition are topics of study. And the community must also be collected in the interpretation of this data. So it's not just they must be involved. They should actually be involved in collecting also and interpreting the data. And this is the reason they should be involved in collection, is so that they are actively engaging with their own community members in acquiring this information. So there's a connectedness. There's also a sense that there's a sense of trust between them and their community members. It's not necessarily to exploit this trust that they must be involved, but it is more so that they continue to remain connected, not just with the people, which they already are, but also with the information that they get from them. And definitely the interpretation, because can you think about it? We look at different practices and we can say that, well, that's an Aboriginal practice or that's not. But really, what's the lens that we're using? So when we come from the outside, we use our own personal lenses. If you're a international person, if you're a person, say, like myself, coming from two different countries, so third country, Canada, my lens is not going to be the same as a person with an Aboriginal lens. People who are born and raised white people in Canada, their lens is a little bit different, and so on. So, it's important to have an Aboriginal person to provide that lens when the data is interpreted as well. So the meaning of Gasventas is the Aboriginal way of knowing. It's also called the two-row wampum. It's basically a treaty to express the rightful relationship between First Nations and European nations. Um, the relationship, when we use the Aboriginal way of knowing, and the relationship between Western knowledge and Aboriginal way of knowing should be considered equal. Do we have the Aboriginal way of knowing? We don't, and that's why having Aboriginal researchers becomes very, very important. Again, using the joint way of learning, it would be a way to promote equitable research in the social sciences and humanities when we work with Aboriginal people. So there were 7 guidelines, right? When we looked, sorry. So there are 7 guidelines. Anytime research is done with Aboriginal people, their knowledge, their culture, the 7 guidelines must be adhered to. It's a very strong requirement that there's a formal negotiation with band councils when you're doing research. Okay. Consent is a little bit different in Aboriginal communities, and depending on the community, the Western way of acquiring consent. How so? From what we've discussed so far, how do we obtain consent when we're doing research? What do we do? Ritika, go ahead.
We normally get a written consent.
Right? Okay, anybody else? Yeah, we normally have a letter of consent. We have them write and we have them sign off saying, I consent to this and I've been informed of A, B, and C. We have to remember that written consent is a very Western concept. It Suzanne says consent from the elders and community. Thank you, Suzanne. 100%. We have to get consent from the elders in the community. And usually what happens is the band itself will comprise the elders definitely. And Suzanne, if I'm getting it wrong, just let me know. It will comprise the elders, but it will also have general representatives of the community itself. So getting consent from the band is very, very important, which includes the elders. But an important thing to remember is that several Aboriginal communities, written consent is seen as a lack of trust. And this is not unique to Aboriginal people, but it definitely is a part of it. In several Indian communities, I'm from India, so I can tell you this. Asking someone to sign off on something is considered a lack of trust. You don't trust the person enough, which is why you're sticking a pen in their hand and asking them to sign something. So there are several deals, even to this day in India, that are just word of mouth. So land sales, property sales. It's becoming harder and harder because India has gone. Oh, Cassidy has a question. So I'll just finish my train of thought before I forget. Um, India is becoming more and more westernized, and the old ways are disappearing, which is unfortunate, but that's a reality. So, in the old days, for example, when my grandfather bought his first house, a very nice city house, it was all like of course, he paid the money and he just took the house. There was no real paperwork. But now it's impossible to do that, and it's changed. But we have to remember that in Aboriginal communities, a formal consent asking for people to sign off on a piece of paper might be seen as offensive. And this is something the researcher has to figure out by perhaps talking to the band as to how they would like to offer consent, and it might just be verbal. Cassidy's question is, would you have to state at the beginning of each research visit that they can remove themselves from the study at any time? That's a great question, Cassidy. I think that applies universally, including Aboriginal communities, just to remind them very respectfully that we'd love you to participate, but at any time, if you're uncomfortable with what I'm saying or I'm asking you to do or provide information, please, without any ill feelings, you can withdraw from the study. And so, this kind of communication is always good. We have to remember that trust has been greatly damaged in Aboriginal communities against Western people, thanks to the residential schools, thanks to all the abuses that have occurred in the past. I should probably stop my video, but Anastasia says this is still big in many small communities especially where there are many elders to do deals over word of mouth that creates strong connection, trust, and future help and like the farmers in our areas. So yeah, it does still happen. We still have agreements, but even for the sake of research, where everything is very formalized in the research world, like we have a research process, it goes a certain way. These are things you do A, B, C, D, and E, and you collect your data, do analysis. And somewhere along the way, there's the consent and information and all of that. And then that works a little bit differently when we work with Aboriginal people. This is good for us to know and understand that it will look a little bit different. Once consent is provided, we have to remember when working with Aboriginal people in their communities, um, there's no question of entitlement. As outside researchers, this is a privilege. We are a guest in their host community. There are rules, there are unspoken rules which we will have to learn and master and follow. It's a sign of respect and it needs to be done. Um, Again, we had the discussion about partnership, participation and ownership. Participation always is voluntary, regardless of who it is. The ownership, who owns the data for an Aboriginal project? Well, the band does, the knowledge keepers do. Yeah, you're a Western researcher benefiting from that information and being able to publish a paper, obviously with their knowledge keepers' names, because the assumption is that you've consulted them and you've worked with them to author this document. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's the community that owns this data. And finally, there are guidelines on what a researcher can and cannot do, specific to the band, specific to the First Nation, and so on. And these are some things that, with respectful consultation, the researcher must make an effort to learn before they go ahead and start doing their work. The final thing is ending the project. Every project comes to an end. Okay. Ending the project requires that, even when we're working with Aboriginal people, it's the rules are generally the same. You have to let them know where that information is available. Some of the recommendations are that when you've finished collecting the data and finished your study, you actually come back to the band, come back to the elders, and you present that data to them, and they can share it with their people as to what their findings are. So every First Nations community is a little different. So Tree says, I would think that we would need a good relationship with the specific community to begin with, correct? 100%. That means learning from the community and getting them to know ahead of time, or having from the community do the research. 100% Tree. And now we have to remember that some communities are quite used to people coming in and speaking to them and understanding what a research objective is and how to go ahead and learn in an objective manner. They might have their own ways of doing it, but this is something they both need to understand. It is a coalition. It is a project done in partnership. With some communities, there might be little to no connection at all. So that relationship would have to be developed first. And that's typically what people do. People will reach out to the band council, and then you wait before you approach the community. And once you get into a band council meeting, if they're willing to listen and chat with you, they will connect you with the people that they think are a good fit to assist you with your project. So you don't want to go into a First Nation and knock on people's doors saying, hey, do you want to do this project of mine? That's inappropriate and not okay. Right, we're at 11:48. We have a good solid hour, so we can go ahead and do the questions at the back of the book. Anastasia says, you must really try and see and hear them from their view without judgment or bias. This has been huge in learning and working with the indigenous communities around me. 100% Anastasia. I mean, it's easy from our perspective. Any one perspective, people from one perspective can always poo-poo the other perspective, and it's important for us to not do that. So that's 100% true. We'll pause for a few minutes just to make sure everybody has a chance to ask questions about ethics itself. But after that, what we will do is we will go ahead and answer the questions at the back of your textbook. Anybody questions on ethics? Tree?
There we go. So I was reading about, I think there's a box in there on ethical dilemmas in research.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering, when we come across an ethical dilemma, like it could be minor or it could be major, like they're talking about crimes and so on and so forth. But what about a minor ethical dilemma? You think that your intervention might actually be too distracting for the participants, or too difficult for them to get to the focus group. They have to their income is low and driving to like do you approach the research board that like with any question like that?
Yeah, you do. And so that's part of the role, part of the mandate of any good research ethics board. And I'll qualify it as a good research ethics board because there are research ethics boards out there who will not give you any help at all. They'll just say, well, why don't you make a change? And then you'll go back with the change. They won't like it. No, this is not okay. This is problematic. Why don't you make another change? Anyway, the point is, yes, the research ethics board should jump in. So let's take your example. Let's say you need someone to come in from the Atikameksheng First Nation here, and we just spoke about working with Aboriginal people. So let's assume that someone has consented to an in-person interview, but then they tell you that, I don't have transportation, so I'm going to have to take a taxi all the way here in Whitefish, and I'm going to have to come to Sudbury to be able to meet you for your interview. We're assuming it's a non-COVID situation. But then are you able to compensate me for gas and travel time or whatever it is? And if that is your ethical problem, I mean, it's already included in the Tri-Council, so you are able to compensate them for those reasons. Other minor ethical things, do you have a specific thing in mind, Tree, that you're thinking of?
Here, unmute. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
I muted myself instead of unmuting myself. Okay. Yeah. So let's say you've noticed that for certain people, your intervention is maybe the timing, I don't know, whatever. You're hearing that they're not sleeping as well at night. And if you're working with a vulnerable group, that's the last thing you want your research to do is to possibly cause some harm. But you do have a timeline to finish your research paper. So that would be kind of an ethical dilemma.
I think things that pertain to health and health conditions are very generally they are treated as severe in nature. So and I, when it's I was uncomfortable, I couldn't sleep. This has bothered me for the last week. The last interview we had, it was quite troublesome. I couldn't sleep all week. You obviously you would thank them for their assistance, see if you can find some resources, which is what you should be equipped with anyway when you go into work with people, and direct them that way, and perhaps not work with this person moving forward because you are at risk of causing them more harm. This is something you can approach your REB with too, telling them, look, this is what happened. I worked with so and so, or one of my people, if you don't want to tell the REB who it is unless they ask you for it. So I'm considering thanking them for their assistance, but I don't want to cause any further damage. I have referred them to A, B, and C. You can't, if our intervention in any way is causing distress, we have to minimize the damage coming out of that situation, and that's where your REB will push you towards as well.
So, and then what if you're during your intervention, here's a very probable thing. You do your intervention is during meal times, and you're noticing that a lot of your residents have both of their brakes on their wheelchairs. You didn't set them, but you know that that's a physical restraint that shouldn't be there. So how do you navigate that? It's totally unrelated to your intervention. It's totally unrelated to your research, but the people you're interviewing, you notice that they're being physically restrained. How would we deal with something like that?
Well, the first thing is, I mean, from an ethical perspective, is there, are they required to be restrained for their own safety? If that's one thing. And first of all, physical restraints, there are, I mean, that's I don't think that they use too much of that anymore, but you can tell me. I mean, I think there are lots of provincial guidelines against using physical restraints, but if that's how they're having their breaks when you can meet them and stuff, first of all, I would ask as to this would be a question for the administrators of the long-term care home. Do they have to be in physical restraints when they're out on their break? And because as a researcher, your concern is when they're physically restrained, they're not quote unquote themselves, and the responses or participation in anything is unlikely to be representative of their true mental state and their true responses. So you prefer to not have to do that. Is that one of the thinking behind what you're asking?
So as a person who works in long-term care, I see things that are done all the time that shouldn't be done. Like, I'm aware of them. And I know that there are other people who visit long-term care and they see things that shouldn't be done all the time. And physical restraint can be as simple as putting somebody's brakes on their wheelchair so they don't move around because they cause a ruckus, right? When they move around, they bump into people and so on and so forth. It's not allowed. It's not supposed to be allowed, but it happens all the time, especially at meal times. They will go and put both brakes on. So if I were to be interviewing these people or applying an intervention, say I want to try a different food, a different presentation for food with these residents, and I notice that both their brakes are on, and this is happening regularly.
So this is a very complex situation, Tree. I don't think an REB would. So these people who aren't able to control their locomotion, either on wheelchair or on foot, and are being restrained a certain way to minimize that. These are people also having difficulty with consenting with you, able to collect data properly. So I think there would be a considerable challenge getting an approval from an REB in the first place in such a complex situation. The second thing, the fact that restraining occurs, and I don't know at what point it becomes unethical in a lived environment, because I guess the long-term care facility has to consider the restraint on these people and the damage they could cause if they were unrestrained, and balance them out, much like what an REB has to do. Is what's the benefits to leaving people unrestrained, and what's the damage as a result? We're all restrained, even being completely normal and able, and it's not a comparison at all. It should never be a comparison. But the point is, we all have restrictions. For example, when we are in flights, there are times when you have to keep your seatbelt on, and yeah, we are physically restrained. When you're driving in a car, we are all strapped in. So there are portions of our life that we're being restrained, some of it of our own violation, but it is still a law, it's a requirement. So it's a hard one. It's a very hard one. I mean, I just don't see an ethics board saying, well, these people have to be physically restrained because they don't regulate themselves, which again shows a certain amount of cognitive decline and deficits, and they go bumping into people. Or maybe they have enough cognitive ability, but they can't just control their gross motor skills. So it makes them a very unique population. So if you had a food-based intervention to try, this would have to come with a very large team, and the testing would almost, I don't know how you do that. It would be a very complex ethics application.
Okay, but I think you're missing my point. As a worker, I know that I can report that situation. As a
So it's not a research question. Okay.
but as a researcher coming from the outside, knowing what I know, would I have an obligation to report? That's basically.
Oh, if you're coming from outside, yeah, you'd have to go to, yeah, 100%. If you are aware that this is unethical. I mean, I think you'd almost have to understand it better. So you know they're being restrained. There are broad guidelines against physical restraint. We know that. I think one of the first things would be to understand why they're being restrained in such a manner despite the guidelines. And of course, if you don't have a satisfactory response, the next step would be to go and report it. Now, this report would not fall into the purview of the REB because this is more of a human rights violation, and it would go elsewhere with all of that.
Okay, that's really where I was coming from.
Okay.
What's the role of the REB in
No,
a situation?
no. It's the REB is to protect the people and you for a violation in the research process. This is not a violation of the research process. This is more physical quality of life. It's a human rights violation. That's what this is. So it's a bit different there. Sorry, long roundabout way to get to the answer. Well, Cassidy says. Anastasia says, you must really try and see and hear them from their view without judgment or bias. This has been huge in learning and working with the indigenous communities around me. That's wonderful, Anastasia. Cassidy says there are reserves where an airplane is the only transportation, so fly in and fly out reservations. So resources for them are very limited, definitely when it comes to mental health resources. That's true, Cassidy. Off topic a bit now, but would that become draining over time for residents, even for the healthcare workers? Yeah, fighting with the system is often challenging, and especially when you look at long-term care, you know, I haven't been into extended care, but if Tree is telling me this is happening, we know that it's not acceptable ethically. So what do you do? I mean, what do you do in such a situation? And there is an obligation to report. But there's also an obligation to find out a little more what's going on here. And obviously, if people can't give you a reasonable answer, then that must be taken forward. When the researchers come in, and for some, it must feel like a cycle. Yeah, possibly. All right, so we'll go ahead and do some questions in the back of your textbook. Some of the questions I don't think we'll get through all, so some of them you can go ahead and do it as homework or figure out for yourself, but we'll try to get through as many as possible. Okay, let's see, I'm sharing my screen. Okay. Question 1, why is the ethical review of research necessary? Why do we need ethical review of research? Steph, go ahead, please.
Well, to the first part of that question, it's because there's been so many bad actors in the past and there's been bad research that has harmed people. And as a result, that's kind of eroded trust on the part of the public. And that's why we need it now.
100%, 100%. Okay, good. Why is this something for which researchers need outside help? And Stephanie kind of answered that because there have been bad actors and bad practices. So, Sri, go ahead, please.
I think too, we need sort of a more arm's length view of what it is we want to do. So a more impartial view, perhaps.
No vested interests. Okay, perfect. List some ethical issues involved in social research. What are some ethical issues that we typically come across? Artika, 100%. Privacy. Let's list about 5. Let's see if we can get to 5. Steph?
Their dignity must be respected.
Thank you. Something in the chat window. It doesn't let me see the chat window, so let's try this. Sorry. No, that's not it. Okay, never mind. What about consent? Consent. Oh, must do no harm. Risk of harm. Consent. What else is an ethical issue that could be involved in social research? Justice. Thank you, Artika. Inclusiveness. Risk of harm versus, I'm going to put the benefits there. Thank you. So there are a lot. There are more than, we can have a lot more than 5. Why is it unethical to waste other people's time? Well, it's unethical to waste people's time because time is an important commodity. Time is something that's probably and this is an opinion, this is not from your textbook, but when you think about it, time is the only currency that you can't actually get back. You can usually earn money back most of the time. You gain some, you lose some, you know, over a lifetime it goes and back and forth. Time only goes one way. Time just goes. So having poor research wasting people's time is completely unethical. Same thing about poorly designed research. Poorly designed research is not just a waste of time. Of course, it is a waste of time, but it also misleads other researchers and policymakers. So it's, again, poorly designed. And this is one thing that universities are actually not good at. Universities are good at identifying vulnerability, consent, privacy issues, a balance of power issues. Again, a balance of power issues, an ethical issue, which can be involved in social research, right? We spoke about that. They're not good at identifying or not good at calling poorly designed research. And that's unfortunate because poorly designed research has consequences as well. Most ethics boards at universities don't call researchers on poorly designed research. So you'll have many research projects which will make a bunch of conclusions based on really poor design. And then, you know, people follow up on that, assuming it to be decent research. And, you know, it's after, you know, sometimes decades that you realize it's garbage. Is it ethical to conduct research in such a way that those following you find it hard to gain access to people for research? Well, the answer is no. So people who follow your research, they find it hard to, you know, access people to conduct a follow-up. That's you know, it's not ethical to do it. So basically the point is, if you were a researcher that walked into, say, a vulnerable community and they had a very bad experience with you, what would happen the next time they wanted to go? And let's say you're a researcher looking at a nutritional thing in a long-term care facility. You're a researcher from Laurentian, and you go in and you offend so many people, or you do poor research, you don't let your data be accessible after the research. Next time someone from Laurentian goes in, what's going to happen to them when they ask the long-term care facility, hey, can I do some research on your subjects? I've had ethical approval. They're going to say no. It's not going to happen. Cassidy, would it not question their incompetence if you waste their time? 100% their competence. Yeah. If you waste people's time, they won't trust you. So if you have a whole bunch of researchers who have poorly designed research with bad questions, bad way of collecting data, sometimes offensive stuff, You ask 100 people these questions, the people aren't obliged to keep quiet. They'll tell another 100 people about it. All of a sudden, anybody from Laurentian wants to ask citizens of Sudbury about anything. They're like, no, this is awful. We're not doing this, right? It's a waste of money, 100%. It's an absolute waste of money, especially when you've asked for, $100,000 from SSHRC and you say, well, I'm spending $20 an hour on my research assistant who's going to go collect the data. You've thrown that perfectly good money away for nothing. This is more of an exercise. Find out the procedures in your university, college, or other institution for the ethical review of research. So this is something you can ask at the place you work. At Laurentian, Laurentian has an REB, and they've pretty much followed the TCPS. So it's not very complicated. Try filling out the required form for a piece of research that you're considering. So all the REBs have a form, an ethics application. I don't know that you need to fill it out for this course, but if you're interested in seeing how to fill it out, I'm more than happy to mark it for you after you're done, just for fun. We don't have to, it's not a marked assignment or something, but you can do it. Does your professional association, now most of you are gerontology students, but some of you have a background of activation therapists or physical therapy assistants and so on. So does your professional association have a code of ethics? Sometimes the School of Nursing, the School of Kinesiology, the School of surgeons, the School of Midwifery, the College of Midwifery, all these are central bodies, the School of Dentistry, there you go. Thank you, Cassidy. They have codes of ethics. And so the exercise is, if so, read it and compare it with the codes of 2 other professions. Again, this is an exercise I'm not going to insist that you go ahead and do, but if you have the time and the urge to do it, learn more, go ahead and do it. My philosophy is this: everyone has to hit a basic level of ability with the research methods course, and the above and beyond is always helpful. So I never discourage people from doing it. I always encourage people to do it. But if you didn't do it, it's not going to impact your understanding of the content of this course. Okay. There is a draft code of ethics for gerontologists as well. Well, thank you, Tree. And there is probably, but we have to realize that gerontology, at least as it stands, is not a protected profession. So even if there's a draft code of ethics for gerontologists, the issue is how do you ensure compliance? And that becomes a challenge with the boards, with the different boards. Like when you have the board of like the College of Nurses, it's a body in Ontario, right? Or the College of Physicians or the College of Dentists. What happens is if you break laws, if you do engage in unethical practices, they can take your license away. Because gerontology is not a protected profession, the draft code of ethics, it's very, very useful. Okay, it's very, very good, but you don't have a license in the first place that a central body can take away. So it kind of weakens what we can do. And it's a different argument. Should gerontology be a protected profession? And I don't agree that there is enough of an argument for that, but there are some people who believe that it should be a protected profession, and I don't know how that'll work. Anyway, that's a different discussion, so we'll not get into that right now. Unique ethical considerations for researching Indigenous peoples, and that's what we've covered in the last 2 lectures. So just go back to the slides. I'll put up the slides today, so you'll have access to that. Many different things when working with Indigenous people. There has to be equity for Aboriginal researchers. Remember that we are guests in their home or land. They own, band and community owns all the information. and so on. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that we covered. So try to keep a few things in mind for our 5 things, which will help you. I'm going to give this for homework. We'll discuss this in next class. What is the OCAP principle? How would you put it into practice? What do researchers mean when they mention decolonizing research? I don't think we spoke specifically about the word decolonizing, even though we went ahead and explained a lot of things, and that came under decolonizing research. What does that mean, decolonizing research? Okay. Artika and then Steph.
By decolonizing, I think it would be to go against their values, their traditional practices, and also to do research that goes against what they believe in.
Decolonizing is the opposite of colonizing. Colonizing would be to say your stuff is useless, ours is better. Decolonizing would be the opposite. So you would say your stuff is as good as mine. Let's consider both things. Okay. So, but yeah, thank you for attempting that. Suzanne had a very interesting saying, using an Aboriginal or Indigenous lens.
We were taught it's all about the worldviews, and Indigenous peoples have a different worldview than the Western society. So it's
100%.
from their.
Suzanne, would you mind sharing an example too, so we all, like, you can educate us a little bit better? Is there a specific example that you can tell us?
It's everything. I don't know how to.
Okay, let me ask you a specific question. Let's talk about the origin of life.
Okay, we believe that we have a circular pattern in life, but the westernized view is linear. So they're more consumed with time. And then communication as well. We have different ways of communicating, like not making eye contact and not sitting directly facing the person. There's just, we have a different worldview, and every research incorporates all of that.
Suzanne, thank you for sharing this. This is actually very interesting, the eye contact principle, because being raised in India, in India too, you don't make eye contact because it's considered disrespectful. Okay, so when I came to the United States 23 years ago, people would assume that I didn't know anything because I wouldn't make eye contact with people. You just didn't make eye contact with people who you held in esteem. Right? So it took me 20 years of having to learn to make eye contact. Of course, when I'm back in India, I have to remember and be mindful that with people older than me, I don't make direct eye contact. Thank you for sharing that. That's wonderful. Anastasia, go ahead, please.
That's another thing that I've found quite interesting, as well as with eye contact. That's something that I'm somewhat of a shy person. So the idea of showing eye contact all the time used to be a very hard thing for me, which when I was talking, especially with, say, my Oma, which is grandmother in the Netherlands and stuff, if you didn't make eye contact, especially with them, it was like seen as a huge disrespect, like you didn't trust them enough to look at them when they were talking to.
Right.
Which was almost something I had to learn, whether I went to see my family in Belgium or the Netherlands, or even when I went to college with some of my friends from India and other places too. It was almost, you had to be aware of the differences that they told you about eye contact or certain things that you said and didn't say, because it makes such a huge difference depending on how they look and view different stuff in the world too. It's very interesting to notice those differences depending on where people are from or even generationally.
Yeah, okay. and thank you for sharing. And that's the thing, right? When you're talking about decolonizing research, it's about understanding the indigenous perspective, the way they view the world, the way they view respect, the way they view information, the way they view understanding. So it's so that's the whole point of decolonizing research, stepping out of what we know as Western researchers and looking at how our Aboriginal people, I cannot say our, that suggests possession, so apologies, but how Aboriginal people in Canada and the world over, how they view the world and how they interpret different things that happen. So that's what they mean by decolonizing research. Tree roast, I thought the way Cassidy, what is Cassidy saying? Approach used to challenge the Eurocentric research methods. Can I say something on that? Well, I think you did. I thought Cass did when I answered the question. In Africa is the opposite. If you don't make eye contact, then you're being disrespectful. Well, thank you for that, Anita. This is very, very interesting because we have such a rich class with so many different types, so many people from different parts of the world. It's actually quite interesting how just the simple concept of eye contact and communication is so different from in different parts of the world. Okay, so moving on, you guys can read a little bit more about decolonizing research in your chapter. There's a lot of really good YouTube videos. If you're interested, just send me an email and I'll send you some really good links. Who are vulnerable people? Why should researchers be concerned about them? Steph?
They're the very old, the young, and people who may not be cognitively intact.
Very old. Young. Arthika says people that are susceptible to harm. Yeah. And it's the key words, two keywords Tree says people with less power. Yeah, so there are many things that identify vulnerable people, right? So age by itself, maybe not. Cognitive impairments, thank you, Carly. But definitely people who cannot consent, vulnerable people, okay? People, and they might not be able to consent because of a power differential, so it does come into that, but it's there. Then people who are susceptible to harm, so for example, if you're interviewing people who have fled a genocide, there's a lot of PTSD and other traumas that they're going to, so they are susceptible. So there are many things that make a vulnerable population. Very young, again, it's an inability to consent. Very old, depending upon their mental status, if there's dementia, if there are cognitive declines and so on, it's an inability to understand. And it all comes down to when you think about informed consent and the ability to withdraw. And these powers that we all have are, if they were to disappear, then you are vulnerable at that point. And there are many things that can make you vulnerable, right? So all of these different factors. Identify some of the key components of an ethical study. I think we can do that. I mean, first of all, we talk about the population, we talk about informed consent, we talk about going through an ethics board, we talk, and so there's a list of things we can do. We talk about protecting privacy. So as long as you can list the 5 principles for TCPS, we spoke about the 5 ethical principles and talk about each of them in a little bit of detail, then those would be the key components of an ethical study. Why do researchers need to be concerned about the power that researchers have over their participants? It doesn't have to be a long answer, but we know the answer to this. Why is it important to be concerned about the power? Why is it important for us to consider why it's unethical for a professor that's teaching you a course to ask you to participate in a study? Steph, go ahead.
Because in order to give consent, people have to be free to give informed and free consent, not be pressured.
Yes. Yep, exactly. Thank you. Yep, so you cannot, it is not consensual if you are influencing free will. And this is a nice, easy question, but why don't researchers use the term subjects to describe people participating in studies anymore? Arthika?
Because participant, it means more voluntary than subject.
Correct, 100%. It implies voluntariness. Because as a subject, you are subjected to things. You don't have a say, right? As a participant, you're a volunteer. There's something in the chat window. And of course, it won't let me see it. Maybe it will. Let's see. Oops, that was the second comment was for the class. Oh no, what did I do? Okay, sorry. Yes, opt out. Let's go ahead and sign. I'm not sure what happened here. We will get back to the chapter momentarily, and I think we have 2 questions left. Okay, there we go. Compare and contrast some of the ethical issues in qualitative and quantitative research. Well, I don't know. That's an essay type things, but essay type question. But what do you think are challenges? We've spoken a lot about qualitative research, ethical issues in qualitative research, right? We've spoken about, when you interview people, people can confide in you, they can give you their information, A, B, C, and the other thing. Ethical issues in quantitative research. Again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have people, each person think up of one ethical issue with quantitative research. We'll have a little bit of a quick discussion before class on Thursday because I don't want to waste too much time there. What is reflexivity? We did not discuss this in class, but has anybody read through the chapter? Does anybody remember what reflexivity is? Tree?
It's thinking about your position and how it's influencing how you're conducting your research.
So thank you, Tree, and thank you, Cassidy. Yes, between the two of you, it's basically looking at the factors that influence our lenses and how we view research. So exactly what Tree said, and Cassidy also added to it in a different way. So it's important. It's a very important skill in conducting qualitative research. Why do you think that might be? What do we do? Oh, Tree, go ahead.
We might use our lens in evaluating what the data that we're getting, and it might not really reflect that data properly, or what the view or perspectives of your interviewees are. So we need to kind of take that bias out, and that's why it's important to be reflexive.
100%. Thank you, Tree. So how do we take those biases out? So Tree has answered this. I'm going to let somebody else jump in. So let's assume that you recognize, let's say as you're going over your interviews, that you're looking at it a certain way and you have a bias for looking at data. How do you, you might know of some, you may not know of others. How do you figure out what are the biases you have and how do you actively work to correct that? Let's start with a simpler question. How do you identify that you have a bias in the first place? I mean, we can just say we have biases, but we don't know exactly what they are. So how do you go ahead and identify that? So one of the ways that is often recommended is that when we set up our research, and we often, especially when we do our interview questions, etc., is we test run them. Okay, we test run them. We have a few people come in for a pilot study. We look at the data, we interpret the data. Then we show it to somebody else to go ahead and interpret that data. Now, hopefully the person comes from a different perspective, different background, still has the skills to do the work. But what that'll do is when they are interpreting their data, perhaps using a different lens, maybe a different set of bias, at the very least, what it'll do is it'll identify the points of difference between the two. All the commonalities are probably most of the unbiased stuff. All the differences between the two of you is where the bias exists. Okay, and those are the things you have to watch carefully and compensate for when you are interpreting your data. Okay, so that's all we have for today. So we're going to finish a little bit early. If anybody has questions on the ethics chapter, we can go over that, or any chapter that we've covered before this. But other than that, this is done. We will meet again next week to, I think it's data analysis and interpretation. Let's take a look. What do we have? Oh, organizing information. Okay, making notes, organizing data, and constructing bibliographies. Well, some of you in this class are already experts at these skills, but yeah, it'll be an interesting class. If it is a questionnaire, Cassidy says, you can always try and word the questions in a way that it asks more generally without bias statements. So Cassidy, the issue is most people, including experienced researchers, unless they've done a lot of work in a similar area, aren't actually aware of all of their biases at any given time. So there's a lot of continuous work, almost, so to speak. So everyone tries to use the least biased kind of questions, but sometimes when you design, especially when you design new questions for interviews, or you direct interviews a certain way, the bias comes out. Okay. Which is why I love peer review. Well, that's a good point, Cassidy. Yeah, because often your peers will call you out on your biases. If you don't identify them yourself, you'll get called out, which is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's not to offend or anything. It's just to improve the quality of the work. Any other questions? Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, one of the students from this class said to write them in the limitations. Is that a correct method? Because I don't know.
So you can.
It would make it sound less credible to me at the end.
Every study, if well, you have to write your limitation. And yes, limitations does make a study sound less convincing. But for an academic to not see any limitations, those are the studies you should run away from. Okay, so it's the exact opposite. If it's a newspaper article, you don't want to cite limitations because it becomes, it makes it look incredible. But for a research paper, if you have no limitations to your study and you're saying that my data explains everything, you have to run away from that.
Okay, thank you.
No problem, no problem. All studies have limitations. There is no such thing as an all-encompassing study unless you're, what's his name, Sigmund Freud, who claimed he had the answer to everything. But anyway, if there are no other questions, you're all free to leave, and we will see you all on Thursday.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Have a good one. Thanks, Cassidy.